All right, we are live. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. For those of you that don't know, this podcast is dedicated to understanding the ins and outs of wildlife science and how we can use that information to make us better or more effective hunters, fishermen. And I think because of this topic, we should probably add managers to the list as well. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that's appropriate.
Yeah. So my name's Mark Barton. You may have seen me on YouTube channels like Mark Goes Outside and Swamp and Stomp. Got my co-hosts Cody Eggenberger and Matt Fuchsia, and today we have the very first guest on the show. We've got the man, the myth, the legend, Travis Thompson. Travis, tell us about yourself real quick. Tell us about All Florida duck ranching. What you do, and why you're here, I guess.
Yeah, Travis Thompson. I'm a fifth generation Floridian, and I run an organization called All Florida. We were one of the principal organizations behind Florida's recent amendment to the right to fish and hunt in the state. Prior to that, our probably our other biggest thing we worked on was a environmental lands referendum for Polk County, where we put a sales tax or a property tax in place to purchase environmentally sensitive lands and working lands. I work quite a bit on advocacy for everything that touches conservation under the Aldo Leopold plow, cow, axe, match, gun philosophy. So if it touches conservation, we touch it. We partner with a ton of organizations, everything from fisheries to sportsmen's groups to ag groups to you name it, just environmental groups. And our goal is really to keep what's wild in Florida wild and you know, continue to improve wild Florida. We talk about authentic conservation. We realize that conservation is very nuanced. It's complicated. There's people here. We got to live here. We got to go to Target. We got to go to the Publix. So we figure out ways that we can work within that. And then under that umbrella, we run an operation called duck ranching, which is the largest waterfowl hunting operation in the state of Florida. So very, very near and dear to my heart is waterfowl. I'm a duck hunter almost before anything else. Like I love ducks so much. So really looking forward to this conversation today.
Awesome, man. I'm honestly, if we have a little bit more time later, like I want to hear a little bit more about this duck ranching thing because, like, I guess the sheer magnitude of what you're doing is way beyond what I had in mind when I just saw like posts on Facebook and stuff like that. Like I'm thinking like, oh, it's cool. He bought like some acreage and like flooded it. He's got ducks coming in, but it goes way beyond that. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if we got time. Um, anyway, so if you haven't listened to this podcast before, guys, the breakdown's pretty simple. Every single episode, we're going to pick a single wildlife research study to go into and sort of break down for you guys. And today we're actually kicking off a 3-part series diving into migratory bird research. And today's topic, we're going to be focused on waterfowl, which is exactly why we've got Travis here. At the end of every episode, we're going to pitch ideas for the next episode, and you guys can vote on which topic you find most interesting so that you have a little bit of control about what we're talking about here. Now, we may gloss over some details as we go over this research, and if you're the kind of person that wants to read about those details, you can download all the papers that we are discussing in these episodes at the link that's down in the description. A couple quick announcements before we dive in, or current events, I suppose. I just went to the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers small game hunt this weekend, and it was a blast. We slayed the squirrels. And if you're interested in coming to an event like that, there's 2 more being planned. One of them is going to be in Zone B at Upper Hillsborough in February. And then we have another one that we're going to plan somewhere in Central Florida. So if you want to know more about events that BHA is putting together, check out backcountryhunters.org/Florida. And then we had a really exciting FWC commission meeting last week. And that's actually kind of the reason that Travis popped into my mind. I was like, man, we got to have him on the podcast. We had a couple really exciting things happen there. One, we're making some changes to Florida's preference point system, and this is going to help us reduce point creep, which I think is a real important thing to do here in Florida. It's been kind of an issue. And we had an update on the Florida bear population, and the good news is it's doing a lot better. It's definitely on the rise, and so with that in mind, FWC has requested a proposal for a potential bear quota that we're going to be discussing at one of the upcoming meetings. But that's a topic for another day. I really would love to dive into the science behind all the bear stuff in Florida. So stay tuned. That's going to be something we get into another day. Yeah, let's dive into this paper. Who wants to take the lead on this one? Just so I can stop talking for a second.
I'll take the lead here. So Mark picked out this great paper that's looking at shifting migration timing of a few different species of ducks here in North America. And a lot of research has been looking at how bird migrations and all sorts of things are changing in response to climate change. So you got warming temperatures, you got shorter winters, you got crazy weather events going on. And this paper really dives into this, looking at 3 different species of birds. So we got mallards, northern pintails, and then blue-winged teals. And what was really cool is that they use the Bandon reports data for this study, and that gave them close to 60 years of data, going from 1960 to 2019. And they were looking at how changes in migrations of these 3 species have occurred over time, really focused on the Pacific and mid-continental flyways, starting all the way up in Canada. If folks are familiar with the the prairie pothole region, the Canadian prairie pothole region. So that's just north of like Montana and the Dakotas, and looking at those migrations all the way down the USA. And so I think it's a really great study, and found some great results.
I think one thing that's also like worth mentioning, like why this is so important, because I if you talk to waterfowlers, like I feel like, especially down here in Florida, like everybody's always talking about like the weather up north, like what's happening up north that's going to potentially start moving birds, and so I think a lot of waterfowlers are focused on this like short term, like this short time scale, like, oh, there's cold weather, things are going to freeze up north, the birds are going to start moving. But this paper really dives into that long term trend, so we can see if there's actually like a shift. And I don't know about you, Travis, but like I hear duck hunters down here in Florida always going, oh, back in the day there was so many more ducks, and I've heard people complain like, oh, it's because we built the STAs, all the ducks left, the like traditional spots we used to hunt, like the older spots. But this paper kind of makes me wonder, like, is it that they are hitting completely different habitats, or are they like short stopping and not making it all the way down here? I don't know.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's funny, like running a duck hunting operation, we hear from clients all the time. They'll call us on Thursday. Hey, man, a front just came through, yesterday or the day before. I think it's going to push a bunch of ducks. And the salesman in me wants to agree with them and say, oh, yeah, absolutely, it's going to push ducks. But I often say, no, it's not going to push ducks. That's not how it works anymore. Like we don't see that lockup of food up north in a warming trend. And so birds aren't going to, ducks are pretty simple, right? They're going to move because of food, safety, or sex. Those are the 3 things. They're a lot like me. So they're not in breeding season right now. So food and safety are what's going to drive where they're at. And if you've got, like it talks in the paper extensively about agriculture, if you've got available food sources and it's not freezing up, covered in snow, locked up, fed out, why on earth would those birds move off of it?
Yep. Yeah, and that actually brings a good point. I was just in Wisconsin for Thanksgiving, and it was like a late Thanksgiving. It was end of November, and my buddy up there that's big into waterfowl, like he was like, oh, like we were talking about, oh, can we get a waterfowl hunt in while we're there? And he's like, well, usually by that time, like everything locks up like halfway through that week, and everything leaves, and some of the rivers, like the flowing water where they're well mixed, had started locking up, which honestly was kind of backwards to me. Like I feel like when the water's flowing, it shouldn't lock up, but for some reason it was. The rivers were locked up, but the lake right behind the house we were staying at was loaded with ducks. And we left. It was 14 degrees out, and that thing was still wide open. So, yeah, I mean, why would they leave? They got plenty of food and everything they need. So, yeah, it's definitely interesting to get into this trend a little bit. And all right, where were we on this paper? Methods. Let's talk about what they did. We'll kind of, like I was saying, we're going to gloss over some details here. So if you guys really want to get into those, check out the download at the link down in the description. Though there was a couple important things to point out on the methods here, like the way that they limited their data set. So the first thing they did was, excuse me, they limited it to recoveries that occurred in the season that was directly after the birds were tagged. So they're only looking at that first migration. They're not, picking up birds that were tagged years ago. Then they also cut off any recoveries that occurred later than December, which made me kind of sad because I was like, man, there's like a ton of, down here in Florida, it's like when a lot of our duck hunting is happening. But their reasoning for that is because they wanted all the different areas along the flyways to be open at the same time, because they didn't want to have a bias towards some of those southern states that are open, a lot later.
They also made a good point that the three species that they're looking at, they typically will reach their final destination by that period, by end of December. So even though there is that cutoff, it really shouldn't have an influence on these results.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Hey, Mark,
yeah.
I had a question about that too. Like, as a non-scientist, it struck me a little bit odd though that it goes September through December, because in the southeastern United States, we're not duck hunting in September. So would there be a bias more towards?
Yeah.
Like I didn't understand that looking at the data. Again, not a scientist, English major here. So like I didn't understand that. That was a question I had because it talked later in the paper about we've seen a decline in the southeastern waterfowl hunting, and specifically called out Louisiana.
Yeah.
But then if you were correlating like September in Louisiana, you've got 15 days of duck hunting.
Yeah.
Versus, I don't know the other states because I'm not a national guy, but it just seemed like something to me that could be examined in a future study.
Yeah, I feel like they were really focused on sort of like the core of the country and kind of forgot about, down here, like, yeah, we have early teal and that's about it. And so, but I thought it was interesting. And when we look at the figures in a little bit, when you look at the map for the teal, it kind of looks like there's sort of it looks like a weird migration pattern, but I think it's because like birds are getting harvested in like early teal. So it looks like they're like transplanted to a different area all of a sudden. It's like, no, they're just being harvested there, but not up north because like they're not hunting yet or something like that. So there's definitely some potential for some bias there. I agree with that. But yeah, like even if we are hunting down here in September, we're not shooting pintails, and we're definitely not shooting mallards. I mean, we're never shooting those unless you're hunting next to Disney. But yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. We'll keep that in mind as we kind of look at some of the data. And then the last limitation they had was they only used recoveries where the location of that recovery was accurate to within 10 miles, which I don't really know how you can determine that when somebody calls in a report and they're like, yeah, I shot it here. And it's like, well, how do you know how accurate that is? But I'm sure they had some method of deciding that.
One other note that I'll just point out that I thought was really kind of fascinating about this is, because they're using these banded bird data, they have really good estimates of the number of birds that were kind of available based on the number of bands that were put out. So from 1960 until 2019, there were 2.5 million ducks that were tagged or that were banded. And this is just in that prairie pothole region. And this is just for those three species, the mallards, pintails, and blue-winged teals. And so I thought that was just like, that's really cool how they have that kind of information. And also,
I
I
thought
was
that
say,
was super impressive too. Like, I mean, I knew banding was like a thing, but 2.5 million. I mean, I guess it is 60 years, but like they were talking about some of the numbers per year of how much they're banding, and that kind of blew my mind. Like, I mean, this is like a big thing. And what's super cool about it, and we might be kind of getting ahead of ourselves here because I really was kind of gonna bring this up like later on, but it's so cool because that information is, it ties in the hunter directly to these data sets, and they're getting information directly from those hunting activities and using that specifically for the management of that, of that hunt. So I
Mhm.
thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Results?
yes, results. Well, I think you kind of just wait. No, there's still teeny little bit here on methods, just how they actually went about doing this. So,
Okay.
so in a little bit, we're going to show you guys some figures. So if you're driving right now, don't pull up the video. But if you have time later, if you want to watch this video podcast, you can do it on either Spotify or YouTube. And you can look at these figures with us, but we'll try and kind of describe them the best way that we can. But what we're going to be looking at is they split the migrational period into 8 2-week intervals, and so we're going to be looking at maps that represent those 2-week intervals, and then they assessed the space and time of band recoveries for those 2-week blocks over 3 20-year time frames. So the first 20 years, the middle 20 years, and then the recent 20 years to see if during those 2-week blocks these birds are being recovered in different areas or at different times. Um, One thing worth mentioning, they did consider they tried to account for banding effort in different regions, so they actually split up um, different parts of the prairie, the Canadian prairie. I forget what the thing's called. The
Or
area,
pothole area. Yeah.
yeah, the pothole area. Um, they did some analyses and found that there was no difference. So we can forget about that if you guys were wondering if that made any difference. It does not. All right, results. Somebody talk instead of me.
Cody, you good to take that?
Sure, I can start it.
You
Uh,
did.
so, of those 2.5 million banded birds over that 60-year period, 185,000 were reported either shot or found dead. 99% of those were shot by hunters. 1% were found dead. Um, then, within the different species, they did find earlier southward movement in some of the species. So for the fall migration with pintail and for the mallards, they did see some short stopping for wintering. And that's based on, should we bring up the figures
Oh
and
yeah,
talk
yeah.
to them?
Here, let me bring it up.
While Mark's
Maybe
getting that
just go
going,
species by species.
I was just going to say, because short stopping was a new term for me. And, I was thinking that I was taking it really literally. Like they were taking shorter stops, meaning like they were doing like, shorter flyovers or something. But it means that they're actually, their final destination is further north. So they're not reaching this far south. So,
Are we looking
like
at
what Cody
this
was
is
saying
this is
there.
the mallard one right here.
Yeah.
Let me move this. Now I can see both your face and the thing. Um Sorry, I wasn't listening while I was pulling that up.
You're good.
But yeah, shortstop, and I agree. Like I was like, what the heck does that mean? But I think this shows it really well, and just to sort of orient people to what they're looking at in this map, because it took me a second to kind of realize what the heck I'm looking at here. So the purple is areas where they remain consistent during these 2-week periods. Then the green is where they were lost. So they used to be there earlier in those earlier 20-year periods, but in the later 20-year periods, they're no longer being recovered there. And then the yellow is expansion. That's where they have started being recovered where they weren't being recovered before. And so what that means is, in terms of migration, whichever direction the migration is, which in this case is south, and I think when we look at pintails, there's a little bit of that westward movement as well. If that yellow is on the upper side of that purple blob, that indicates that that they're potentially short stopping. That indicates that they are being recovered further north during that time frame that they had been in the past. And if that green blob is on the south side of that purple blob, that would indicate that they're not moving as far south. Again, an indication of short stopping. Whereas in those earlier weeks, if you notice the yellow being underneath the purple blob, that would indicate that they are starting their migration earlier. And conversely, if the green is on top, that they're again starting their migration earlier. So I don't know if I did a good job at explaining that, but in this particular case, like here, if you guys, those of you that can't see, I'm pointing at one of them. You can see the yellow is, further south of that purple blob. And this is an indication that during this October 16th to the 31st, these birds are leaving, or they're moving faster. They're getting further south than they have in the past during that time. And then if we look down at here, December 1st to the 15th, this green being right here along the coast indicates that those birds are not making it as far south. They're not making it to the coast. And that part right there, in my opinion, is, I think, one of the more significant findings of this study. Mm-hmm. That those birds that are not making it all the way to the bottom of their range.
Yeah, I think it said for mallards, it's they're short stopping by like 100 and a little over 110 miles. Pintails like 140 miles, and that's a lot of miles. I had to figure out kind of a reference for that. So I looked into different states, like how wide states are from north to south. And that's almost equivalent to the whole state of Pennsylvania, like going from north to south of Pennsylvania. So that's a huge reduction in some of these migrations.
Yeah.
For those southern states. And it was interesting though. So there was the three species. Pintails, mallards are seeing that difference, but for the blue-winged teals, they did not see that difference, and they get into that a little bit in the discussion.
Yeah, we can pull up each of those maps and just kind of talk about some of the things that stand out to each of us, maybe.
Yeah.
Everybody good on mallards here?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's go down to
Pintail?
this. So this one's pintail right here. So what? Like, there's a lot of yellow blobs here, which I thought was interesting. This is like one of those where I was like, what the heck's going on here? Because that, like, for instance, you guys can see my mouse, right?
I actually can't.
No, I can't see it.
Oh, well, I'm sitting here pointing at things, and apparently nobody can even see it. So on like the October 16th through 31st and November 1st through 15th, these big yellow blobs, they kind of had me scratching my head, because the purple blobs that were up north in Canada in the 2 periods before that kind of like disappeared. And I was like, what the heck's going on here? And I wonder if that's maybe because, like, maybe they're just not even hunting up there at that period of time. I don't even know. I don't know what the seasons are in Canada. Mm-hmm. But I thought that was kind of weird. But this November 1st to the 15th is kind of crazy, because it's showing that these birds are moving to the southern parts of the country like significantly earlier, and they're not being recovered at all, like up north. And that's November 1st to the 15th. Like, that's very much mid-season, no matter, especially if you're up north there. So that's kind of crazy. You're not being able to shoot pintails anymore up north, according to this data.
Hey, Mark, something we've noticed on the ground is massive influxes of all ducks, So something that's discussed in the paper, but not really discussed in real life a whole lot, is the impact of photo period on waterfowl. So
Mm-hmm.
day length driving migration. That's why we have an early teal season, because so many teal are driven by photo period. And so that day length flips in September, and whenever that full moon is, you're going to see massive amounts of birds move. We've noticed two things happen there in Florida, and this is not just our properties, but we've noticed it on public lands, other land managers, et cetera. One, that day length move seems to be coming a little bit later. Like the birds seem to be about 2 to 3 weeks behind the last 5 years. It's not to say we don't have any, but we don't have the quantity that we usually do. The second thing that we've noticed is that by early October, we have big ducks on the ground in Florida that are here for 3 to 8 weeks. Just depends. They almost always have moved on by the start of regular season, though. So we're seeing these photo period affected migrators come. They're slipping a little bit on the front side, but they are coming in mass. I mean, we're seeing, I don't know how to count ducks, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And they're moving out of the state entirely, which is a conversation I've been having with FWC about potentially looking at season changes within the federal framework to maybe move some dates around, because I feel like we're getting the most of our ducks here prior to ever being able to pull a trigger and shoot at them. They're just moving on. And we're seeing that with pintails. So we'll have massive groups of pintails here in October. Never get the trigger pulled on them. They'll move out before regular season. They'll move out actually on that first big front that we get, but they're not moving so much from the push of the weather as much as the barometer change is our belief. Like they're not, because nothing's freezing up the food, nothing's knocking down the food. It's really that drop in barometer, you lose ducks or gain ducks down here.
Right.
But it's just some stuff that I saw that kind of dovetailed into this. Florida's not covered in this, but it's interesting to kind of see that dynamic play out on the ground down here.
Yeah, it's a good point that Florida's not in this. I mean, when we look at the teal map, Florida's included a little bit, but yeah, I mean, these yellow blobs that I'm talking about here in October, November might be indicative of exactly what you're talking about. That shows that these pintails are moving down early. And I mean, yeah, Florida's not in here, but I'm sure if we included the Eastern Flyway, we'd be seeing them, coming down into Florida. What's also really interesting, though, is in those later periods, November, like mid-November through late December, they're showing, I guess, a good thing here is that these pintails are still reaching the southern end of their range along the Gulf Coast, but they're also like a lot of them are stopping early. So we're getting less birds. They're making it all the way to the southern end of their range in those later months, which would potentially explain why you're seeing a lot more of them early in this or before the season starts, and then during season we're getting less and less because they're short stopping.
Well, couldn't that also account for reverse migrators that are those early birds? Because I know that we've traditionally seen a big push of pintails around the winter solstice, around the 22nd.
Mm-hmm.
You'll usually get those reverse migratory birds. So we cut off at the end of December, but this data could include, as they were taking that sample, there could be birds that migrated in September south on photo period and are migrating north and harvested on that backside of it. I'm sure it's not a statistically significant number, but it could be included there.
I mean, I hadn't even considered that. That's a really good point. And I don't think there's really any way for them to differentiate between that, because all
Right.
they're doing is just, getting the birds that had bands on them. It's not like they know which direction they were going.
Right.
I'm just imagining birds that have like those satellite trackers on them. They do it for other migratory
Telemetry.
birds. Exactly.
Telemetry
satellite
studies.
telemetry. Yeah. But those transmitters are expensive, and I could see scientists not being too happy about the transmitters getting blown off the backs of some ducks. But it'd be kind of a funny observation. But that's the nice thing about this banding program is that they work so well, and it's so cheap. I imagine it's so cheap, especially compared to telemetry, to get a lot of bands out there. And I've gone out waterfowling with some buddies, and someone gets one of those bands, and that's the highlight of the day is when someone gets a band on a waterfowl. So yeah, it's
on that on that note, I just was curious, like what the percentages of the bands that actually were harvested, that 185,000
Mhm.
versus the 2.5 million that were actually banded, and it's like less than 1%. So it just goes to show like how
Yeah,
rare it actually is to get a banded bird.
you're saying less than 1% for because the 185,000 and 2.5 million, isn't that like it's like 70?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was
Yeah, it's 7.5% of
seven,
the
7%.
banded birds were, yeah. But we don't know what the total population is, so um,
But
it's
I also think when you're down in Florida, your chances of getting a band are just that much lower
yeah,
because like a
been
lot of
picked
the
off.
birds, yeah, a lot of the birds have already been shot. A lot of them are not even making it this far down, according to some of this data.
Mhm.
I've never shot a band. Um,
We do band. That's another conversation I think that's kind of ancillary to this is the significance of resident birds.
Mhm.
So if you talk about the shifts in a migration, um, one of the things we attribute that to a lot when I talk to other scientists is warming trends that we see and that migration shifting westward, staying more northward. The kind of flip side or upside to that is a species like the black-bellied whistling duck, which we banned a lot of in state of Florida. We're beginning to see those creep and expand northward as well and expand their range to become another target, so to speak, to fill the gaps in for where you're not seeing the true migratory birds. I know there's still a migratory bird on the MBTA, but the true migratory birds we're not seeing as many come. So having kind of those local resident ducks is significant, and seeing them expand their range is significant.
yeah, that's a really good point because one of the things they talk about in the discussion of this paper is the potential to lose revenue from those southern states because duck hunters won't travel much. But those birds are definitely gonna help keep some of those southern hunters engaged potentially. Um, all right, let's look at blue winged teal and then we've got all the data. How do I get here? Here we go.
I can see your mouse now for some reason.
Well, you
Over on
couldn't
the
see.
side there.
Oh, you can see my mouse. Oh, that's weird. Oh,
No,
you know what?
well, it's
You
when
know
you're on
what?
the figure. I can't. Yeah.
Oh, that's weird. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh,
There's some magic happening here.
yeah.
Um. All right. So blue winged teal. See, this is what I was talking about before. Is like these big green blobs in September up north. Um. To me, is indicating that they're migrating earlier. Um. But one thing I also wondered about, I don't know if you guys thought about this, is like over those 60 years, like how much have like season dates changed in some of these different areas? Like, for instance, here in the Midwest, it's showing that like they used to recover a lot of blue winged teal there in September, and now they don't recover any blue winged teal there.
Mhm.
Did the season dates change? Like, are they not hunting blue winged teal up there during that time frame? I have no idea. Like I don't know those details. But man, that seems like a pretty significant change there in September, the first 2 weeks of September, that basically the entire Midwest is no longer able to shoot blue winged teal. That's kind of wild to me.
I think the other thing that it's interesting because it says it in the paper, and I made a note about it. It actually talks about the significance of here it is the value of the mallard as a representative of all dabbling ducks and
Mhm.
management plans. It talks about the significance of mallards like nationally. It also makes me wonder if people pass on blue wings in some of those areas to target mallards. This is not a science thing. This is a marketing thing.
Mhm.
Open the cover of Ducks Unlimited, open the cover of your Delta Waterfowl magazine, open BHA's, but like any article talking about duck hunting is largely going to talk about greenhead mallards. So it makes me wonder if over time we've pushed people towards big ducks are better than small ducks, and we've seen a lot of people don't even roll out of bed until they can go kill greenheads. I don't know. I don't know how you'd even measure that. Like I said, it's not a science thing. I think it's a marketing thing, but I do think there's something to that idea.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder like it would have been really nice if they also had some measure of like hunting pressure, like hunter hours put in.
Hunter effort.
Yeah,
Hunter effort.
hunter effort. And weighted, the data somehow using that. Um,
They
because
did a little bit because they used the number of bands they returned. It's not a perfect metric of effort, but they, like you
yeah,
said earlier, there was one period where there was a little bit of an increase, like in the 1980s to 1990s period, where there's a slight increase in some tagging efforts for one of the areas. But also, they're just looking at tagging effort, I believe, for like the Canadian provinces, and like Travis was saying, there's a lot of different places that are putting these bans on birds. But they were looking at at banding returns, banding reports, and they didn't see any strong relationship or correlations with the banding report numbers. So it does seem that from that perspective, hunting pressure has remained fairly stable.
Yeah, they talked about that a little bit with the Pacific Flyway and how it's apparently kind of recovered, or it's looking like it's recovered from this study. And they do mention hunting effort allocation could have accounted for those shifts. Um, and but they do say that the harvest rates were stable
Mhm.
at like 14% across the period for what was that, for the mallards, and about 31% for pintail. But that was my question too. It's not just harvest. Um, Generally within the flyway, it's where hunters are actually going and harvesting. That's going to affect these kernel densities in my mind.
Mhm.
The other significant thing they alluded to in here is blue-winged teal's feeding habits.
Yeah, that was really
Like
cool.
like your pintails and your mallards will gladly feed on crops, your corn or your wheat or whatever. Blue-winged teal or not, they're going to feed on smart wheat or duck potato or whatever. They're going to find something kind of naturally occurring, and it makes me wonder, like, could you go a step further and look at like hydrology patterns here and look at early successional growth of plants that drove where the teal ended up, because they're not going to stop if there's no food.
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, and also with those crops, like I think humans have a little bit more of a say in like when crops are available, whereas those naturally occurring food sources are going to be a lot more susceptible to changes caused by potential climate change and things like that, which might be why we're seeing such you know a pretty drastic pattern on this map. I mean, look at how much green is up on the north side, indicating that they're moving earlier, or in this case, the yellow being on the south side of the purple blob, like in October. Um, and I think this map also indicates that a lot of these birds are like gone out of our country, by November, because they're all like right in that small little range along the Gulf Coast. But yeah, I think they're still moving at that point. It's just we're not getting recoveries because they're probably in a different country. And
Yeah.
what like isn't Argentina like one of the areas where blue winged teal are like massive during certain times of the year? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that was one of the things that the paper was saying for why you might not see that short stopping, and why these trends with the teal are showing up is because they are such long distance migrators. Like Travis was saying, they're really dependent on these natural food sources. So even if you have a whole bunch of agriculture and crops for them in the further northern latitudes, that doesn't mean anything for these guys. They're going to keep on going south until they get what they need.
yeah, I remember seeing a post on Instagram a while ago of like there's this dude called like Plink the Bander. I'm sure Travis, you've heard of this guy.
Paul Link is his name. Paul Link. He's banded more ducks than anyone alive.
Yeah, it's crazy, but he I think it was him that had put like a satellite tag on a teal, and
Mhm.
this thing flew from like the Midwest to like Cuba, like in one day, like without stopping, plopped down plopped down somewhere like 6-7 miles offshore, like in the ocean, for like 2 hours, took a break, and got up and flew the rest of the way. So like in 24 hours, this thing flew like 6,000 something miles, and it's just like insane to me the kinds of migrations that these birds are doing.
Yeah,
You know?
that's crazy.
Yeah. Also, I can't even imagine a teal hanging out 7 miles offshore, like just chilling.
All right.
Um, but so with that in mind, let me stop sharing this so I can see your beautiful faces again. Um, there we go. Um, so like let's just kind of summarize like the main findings of this paper, because I think they summarize them pretty well. So for the mid continent flyways, they concluded that mallards and blue-winged teal were migrating faster, and that pintails were actually starting earlier. And then,
And well, I just wanted to just point out like that's the opposite of what you'd expect, right? That earlier migration, because we're saying
yeah,
how things are warming up, they should be able to migrate, later in the year. And I was happy that the paper did provide a little bit of more feedback on that as like some potential reasonings for that might be related to like non-breeding birds that are migrating earlier. That's what they find with pintails, and how that might be related to like greater frequency of droughts. If you have a drought season, the birds might not be breeding, so they're moving a little bit earlier. And I guess the other thing that they were talking about was just the whole migration cycle. So you have the southward migration in the fall, northward migration in the spring, and that northward migration is shifting earlier in the year, which makes sense, right? Because you have warmer springs. So if that shifts earlier, is that now causing that fall migration to shift earlier? So some really interesting things there. They weren't able to pinpoint what it was, but gave some reasonings for why that observation with the pintail might be occurring.
and that kind of brings up a question. If the earlier fall migration is due to the earlier spring migration,
Mhm.
are there like any ecological disadvantages to them leaving those prime food sources up north earlier,
Mhm.
um, for whatever reason? I don't know. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because Travis, you were talking about some of these birds. Uh, or sorry, no, I was talking about that the map was showing that these birds are leaving earlier, um, but it's not what we would expect. So
Right.
it's definitely kind of weird that's the trend that we're seeing.
At least
You
Uh,
with
know, you know,
pintails, yeah.
something else that it sticks out to me as you guys are having this conversation is within the Lincoln data, we would have the band data, we would have uh, hatch year versus non-hatch year birds. So when they band them, they're either this year or they're after this year. It'd be interesting to overlay that with the data that they had, because it's all, I mean, we're not going out and getting new data, right? This is all in a database somewhere. It'd be interesting to look at that correlation between juvenile birds to see if that shift in migration is somehow correlated to harvest of banded birds that are young of the year. Because traditionally, we always believed the number I've always heard bandied about was 70% of ducks taken are hatch year birds because they're dumber, like they're
yeah,
more susceptible to decoys and calls, etc. I'd be interested to see if that correlated to this westward migration, or if we've seen older birds move the migration that way. I don't know. Be an
yeah,
interesting conversation,
for sure.
and the data exists.
Who knows? Maybe the authors
Yeah.
of this paper will listen to this and go, "Oh, we should answer that question." This is a really new paper. Like, it was just
Mhm.
published last year, so all of the researchers should still be cranking on this data set, maybe.
Yeah. Could always have a new one come out. Stay tuned.
Um, so then, let's see. We were talking mid-continent. Mallards and
Yeah.
pintails are showing signs of short stopping, but the blue-winged teal are consistent in where they're ending up. And then on the Pacific side, the mallards began earlier. Um, and I thought it was also interesting, and Cody, you kind of touched on this, that the mallard and pintails, a higher proportion of banded birds were starting to be harvested in the Pacific Flyway.
Mhm.
And like I don't know, I think that indicates that there might be a shift towards that Pacific Flyway, which is kind of interesting.
And that was one of the things that they were thinking is, that um, like we said, there was possibility of it being associated with hunting pressure, but they didn't really think that was the case because the harvest reports have remained stable. Potential for banding effort, maybe for mallards. There were a few more mallards that were tagged, but for pintails, it stayed the same. So that's what they think is that, it could be related to this shift in flyway choice where you have a greater food availability for these birds. Like we're saying, these birds really like ag, and there's a lot of heavily irrigated agricultural landscape in that area. And so, if birds find that, is it just a shift in where these birds are going? And, it's just bird migrations in general. So, fascinating migrations in overall, it's just these animals, they learn something and then they're able to return to those locations time and time again. And it makes me wonder, was there like some storm or something that got initial group that went out west, and ever since then they've just started to follow that behavior.
Well, and like when a bird's migrating, like what makes it go, you know what, next year I might go over there instead, like
Right.
I've been going to the same place every single year, but now I'm going to try something different. Like what caused them to make that decision? Like,
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and I think there's something to. I read a paper. It was several years old, and it was an older paper, and it was several years ago when I read it about. We all believe that birds come to the same place every winter, but their site fidelity in the winter is actually really low. Like they're very they are not as married to the site as we tend to believe they are, which would lend itself to shifts in migration. But then it even makes me wonder further, like if you have an area where you put a tremendous amount of hunting pressure on a bird,
Mm-hmm.
could that cause them to shift? And then your hatchier birds just don't know any better. Their site fidelity is not to this spot, it's to somewhere else because that migration has shifted. Like, is there, I'm sure, like in everything, there's a bunch of factors here, but it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
yeah. And I think I brought this up in a different episode about the salmon being genetically predisposed to straying.
Mm-hmm.
Did I? I feel like that was on this podcast. I was talking about that, but yeah, like salmon have this like genetic predisposition that like a certain percentage of them have this like mutation that causes them to not go back to their native stream. And I wonder if the same thing might apply here, that some birds are just like going to explore something new just to keep that genetic drift going,
Yeah, I had a question
Well,
about some of
yeah.
that. Just real quick, we should save some time for Travis's stuff. We're gonna do
Well, we
that.
got 10 minutes.
Yeah,
So,
we got to go quick. To you duck hunters though, I've never duck hunted before. This is all new to me. I saw a post the other day that there's a recent study, the Atlantic Flyway. It was with mallards in the Atlantic Flyway, and they found that 5% of our birds are actually wild, like truly wild. And now we have these farm birds that are interbreeding. I didn't know anything about this, and they attributed some of the migration change to these new genetics coming into the population. Is that also the case out west where or in these central flyways they have these farm raised birds escaping and mixing their gene pool and maybe changing behavior?
So I'll go quick on this if you want, Mark, because I
yeah.
know Phil. I know Phil Livretsky pretty well. He's probably the author of that or the
I don't.
faculty sponsor of it or whatever. But yeah, we've seen that shift. Game farm mallards are primarily an East Coast thing. Back in the early 1900s,
Oh,
mid 1900s, people wanted to release mallards so they could hunt at whim. And so they did. Those mallards have kind of taken over. But what we have seen is you can measure the bill size and the bird body size. We've seen those mallards actually shift west as well, which feeds into exactly what we've been discussing here. So you've started to see those birds begin to be harvested in the central flyway, which is not something you should have seen. And they're such a dominant species because they breed. They're raised for producing multiple clutches a year, et cetera. We're starting to see those infiltrate. And yeah, less than 5% of the mallards on the Atlantic Flyway are wild greenhead mallards. And honestly, that may be high at this point. So I think
okay.
having Phil Livretsky on for you guys to discuss this with would be incredibly good. He's so sharp on this stuff. This is his
Yeah,
thing.
I haven't talked to Phil in years. Me and him actually put a proposal together a few years back to do some salmon work in the Arctic, actually, because he's at the same university as one of my colleagues for my PhD. But yeah, I could totally hit him up and see if we can get him on.
That'd be cool.
Yeah. Anyway, let's keep moving because we got to start wrapping things up. Let's talk about like the implications here of what we're finding. And to kick that off, like the first thing that came to my mind when I saw these numbers, it was like 224 kilometers of like difference of like short stopping for mallards and like 100 something miles. Sorry, kilometers. How significant is that actually? That was my first question. I was like, over the course of like thousands of miles that these birds are traveling, like how significant is it really that these birds are stopping like, 150 miles short? That was my first thought, which I think was quite naive. And then they kind of addressed that by pointing at this, the revenue side of things, because so much of the money that goes towards conservation and like habitat restoration efforts is coming from these waterfowl hunters. And if we start having birds stopping short and not getting to those southern states, they basically pointed out that could amount to like a third of the revenue that's generated by waterfowl hunting, which obviously is going to have a huge impact on those conservation efforts across the entire country. So
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty significant and mention worthy.
just building on that, it also just goes into the whole conservation picture of migratory birds, where you can do as much as you want in one part of the habitat for those birds and protecting that habitat, but if their entire stretch isn't being protected, or if you have maybe the mallards aren't moving as far south, but there's other birds that are dependent on that habitat, and now you don't have as much funding for that habitat, those other species might now face some new threats because they don't have that habitat available to them. And it's just something where migratory birds face so many difficult challenges, and this could add another one to them if you're not getting that funding from hunting for some of these targeted species.
Well, and I think that's also why we have to manage this at a federal level, because we need to make sure that everybody's game, that everybody's in sync with each other, and that like you said, the habitat's being protected across that entire flyway. Mm-hmm. One thing I also thought was really cool was their advocacy for multi-species studies to drive management decisions, which is something I think here in Florida we've been talking about for a really long time. And they also do address like the value of single species management, because it's cheaper. It's simple. If you can find a keystone species that is a great indicator of like the entire community, that's fantastic. And I think, in the aquatic world, like oysters is like a pretty good example of one that people have been using for a really long time. Seagrass is another one. Mm-hmm. But I think it's pretty rare that you find a single species that, it can be such a great indicator of an ecosystem's health. And in this case, mallards are being used, but this kind of shows that that's not good enough. That there are differences between different species, and this is only 3 of those species. So, what's it going to look like when you actually start banning a lot more of these other species and get a better idea of what their migrational patterns are looking like? And that's really what they're pushing for here, is like, we need to start banning other birds. And that might mean that less mallards are getting banded. But that's what we need to do so that we can appropriately adjust season dates to match up with the migrations that these birds are actually doing. So I thought that was really cool. Everybody agrees, apparently.
Yeah.
All right. Well, usually we end this with sort of the question of like, how's this going to change what you do in the field? But I think in this case, it really comes down to like, how's this going to change the way we think about management? Because this isn't necessarily going to make you a better or worse hunter.
Less time in the southern states, apparently.
Yeah, we've got to start traveling north. But Travis, since this is something that you really focus on, like, has this given you any new information that you might like take into account when you're talking with with FWC about potential season dates?
I think the bigger thing here is we're talking about a human dimensions problem. Like when you talk about the hunting side of this, because if you're not getting the birds where you want them, like how you sell hunting, how you market hunting, how you recruit hunters, that's a human marketing, human dimensions type story. So I think this definitely affects how we tell that narrative and promote hunting recreational consumptive use. But I also think this is significant for a broader conversation with like the Flyway Council in how we set season dates, how we look at what those should be, because kind of as you guys were talking about single species management and the difference between these species, um, we lump ducks into this 107 day. They outline the framework there for the Pacific side, but I know that in Florida you get 60 days after October 1st. You can have up to 15 days before that, and how we kind of tinker with that framework and those dates within that. I think that's significant. And that's a FWC conversation that we've already started having kind of based on anecdotal knowledge of this study, but also like seeing the real data behind it. But I think there's a conversation there too that's going to have to happen at the Flyway Council level, which is this big hierarchical, like it's just a big machine that's going to take a long time to get to move on this stuff. They kind of do things the way they've always done it because it's safe. So I think studies like this are super significant for us because we're able to use those as leverage to kind of push that conversation forward with this institution that's going to take some movement to keep hunting relevant moving forward.
Yeah, yeah, it's all really good points. All right, let's wrap it up, guys. Let's pitch our ideas for next week. Um, so I'll start. I've been really focused on snipe these days, and I realized that there's not a lot of research on the Wilson snipe, which is the snipe we get down here in Florida. So I started looking into that, and once again looking at migrational patterns, and I found this really cool paper that basically shows that the migration of snipe is a lot bigger than a lot of people believed that it would be. So that's my pitch. If you guys want to hear about snipe, vote for me. All right, Matt, what do you got?
Yeah, so I'm sticking on the waterfowl train, and moving from migrations to ammunition types and looking at how bans on lead ammunition have influenced duck and goose crippling rates. And this is looking at some results from Illinois. So, everyone, or I imagine, I don't know if all states do it, but I would hope so, have, caused or have shifted from lead ammunition to steel shot, for example, for waterfowl, and seeing what the impacts of that have been on these bird populations.
All right, I'm going to pitch the same quail paper I had a couple of weeks ago. We've still got a few weeks left in our small game season, and it is quail habitat selection pre and post mating season and how that shifts.
Nice. Travis, I'm just curious, which of the three would you pick?
Listen, I'm a snipe guy, so I love snipe dearly. But my heart is with quail. Like I grew up quail hunting, so I think quail discussion is always fun discussion. So I think I'd go quail in this one.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a fun conversation. I'm not saying no to snipe ever. I'm just saying like, come on, Mark, snipe season just started. Like,
I know.
give my man a break here.
That's why I'm so excited about it right now. Cool. Well, make sure that you go in and vote for the quail one. All right, let's wrap it up. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and if you're new to the podcast, make sure you hit that follow button or subscribe, depending on what platform you're listening or watching on. Let's see. Next podcast is gonna be right around Christmas, so just in case it comes out right after that, happy holidays to everybody, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode. Thanks, Travis.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.